Alexa, does God still heal?
I don't know that one. I can't do explanations yet.
But this morning we're going to answer the question, why don't we see more miracles today? Why don't we see more miracles today? I think the reality is that sometimes we think in terms of what's around us. So we don't see miracles, therefore miracles must not be happening. But two things you have to remember, and the first is this. The first thing I want you to consider when we talk about miracles is that miracles are not common. Miracles are not common. If they were common, they'd be called comicals. They're not common. We don't see miracles. The reason we call them miracles is they're outside of the norm. They don't happen all the time. Even in the Bible, we read the Bible and think miracles were happening all the time. But the reality is, between the Old Testament and New Testament, depending on how you try and isolate and count specific miracles, there's approximately 165 miracles recorded in the whole of the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's about 80. In the New Testament, there's about 85. That covers a span of human history of about 4,500 years. And it records 165 miracles. Even while Jesus was on earth, of the 85 miracles recorded in the New Testament, about 40 of them are attributable to Jesus. So miracles weren't happening all the time. They were isolated incidents, moments when God moved in divine power. So don't think, we're not seeing miracles on the scale that we saw them in the Bible. Now, to be sure, some of the miracles attributed to Jesus are, he went into a village and healed all that were sick. Is that a singular miracle or is that multiple miracles? Yes, it's both. So it says this about Jesus in the book of John, towards the end of the Gospel of John. Jesus did many other things as well. Not just miracles. He did many other things. He taught many other things. He did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So we know Jesus did more than 40 isolated, singular miracles. But they're not recorded for us. We don't know. We just know that they were there. But Jesus' ministry was also unique. He ministered in a way to show his divinity. Never before and never since has God taken on human flesh. God in the flesh. That's what Christ came. So his miracles, the way he moved, the way he operated was different than anyone else in human history. Jesus never failed in anything that he accomplished. Anything he wanted to do, anytime he spoke. If he said to someone, get up, they got up. If he spoke to the dead and said, rise, they raised up. He acted in a unique way. So sometimes we think, we don't see miracles happening on that scale, the way Jesus did, the way the apostles did. And it shakes our faith. I just want you to know, first of all, if you walk down the halls of a hospital and your shadow falls upon a sick person and they don't get well, don't let your heart be troubled. Okay, one of the apostles had that happen. His shadow would fall upon him and they would get well. But that may not happen for you. You may pray over a handkerchief, over a towel, and send it to somebody, and they may not get better. That doesn't mean you don't have enough faith. It means that God doesn't always move in the same way throughout human history. That's why they're miracles. We don't see more than one time God speaking through a donkey, unless you count every Sunday when I preach. But the reality is they're isolated one time. One time a whale swallows a prophet and then vomits him up on the shore. We don't see that over and over again. One time an axe head floats. So those are times that God moved in that way. And so because we don't see God move through us the same way he moved in the Bible, doesn't mean there aren't miracles happening. Indeed, I believe if we could somehow step back and view everything that God's doing here now in the world today, on the cutting edge of ministry in third world countries and unreached people groups, when the first missionary or evangelist shows up there, I think we would be shocked at how many miracles are happening. Miracles are happening, but we don't see them. See, you may have never seen a miracle, but that does not mean they are not happening. So often we think, I didn't see it. Well, can I just say, who are you? I mean, if you didn't see a miracle, they must not exist. So just because you don't see a miracle doesn't mean they're not happening. I think about a story of a young man who decided he wanted to go and explore the world. He packs up his bags, walks out into the street, goes to the street corner, and waits for the bus. Bus doesn't come. The next day, goes out, stands on the street corner, waits for the bus. Day after day, for 3 weeks, he waits for the bus. After which he declares buses no longer exist. The reality is, buses still ran. Buses still pick people up and drop people off. They just didn't go by that street corner. And so because he didn't see the bus, he says there's no buses. We don't see the miracles. We say God's not doing miracles today. Sometimes you have to be in a place where a miracle is necessary. So remember this. You may have never seen a miracle, but that does not mean you should not expect a miracle. Okay, you've not seen a miracle, but they still exist. God has not forgotten how to do miracles. God has not lost his power. God has not lost his divinity. God can still move in the miraculous, and he can break out in a miraculous revival anytime he wants for his glory, for his honor. He can do that. But just because you haven't seen one doesn't mean you shouldn't expect one. Jesus said this. Jesus said, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than this, because I am going to the Father." So one reason we don't see miracles today, or as often today, is because we're not in a place where miracles are necessarily needed. Listen, I thank God for living in America. I thank God for the medicine that we have and the understanding and the advancements that God has granted us through human wisdom and understanding. There's nothing wrong with that. Human wisdom and understanding does not diminish a miracle. Speaking of that, in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is writing, he's talking about the supernatural gifts. He says, "I will pray in the Spirit and I will pray with my understanding. I will sing in the Spirit, I will sing supernaturally, but I will sing with my understanding." There's a way in which God uses human understanding, human intellect, and that is no less awesome. It may not be your miracle. So I just want to say, when we talk about miracles this morning, there's a lot of things we call miracles. And they may be wonderful, they may be awesome, they may be awe-inspiring. That's what awesome means, full of awe. Fill us with wonder, the birth of a child. But it's not a miracle. It's a miracle, it's just not a miracle. It's not a supernatural miracle. So we're talking about supernatural miracles. But God working through medicine is no less wonderful. As a matter of fact, if all we needed were miracles and not medicine, then Paul would not have written this to Timothy. Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Why didn't Paul just say, just have faith, I prayed for you, and be well? Because God doesn't just work supernaturally. God works through the things that he has placed in our understanding and our ability to grow and use wisdom and all those things. So that one reason we don't see miracles as often today is we're not in the place where we need a miracle. I remember talking to Dr. Rutland. He has traveled all around the world. His stories always make me go, wow. So he talks about one time he was in Africa. He was in West Africa in a remote village, and they were going to be doing a revival service. Now, you go to West Africa, this was back in the late 70s. You went to West Africa in the late 70s and said, we're doing your revival service. There was nothing. There was nothing. No one had anything to do. There was no electricity. There was nothing. So they'd show up with a generator and a sound system. Everyone would show up. 10,000 people would show up. It's the afternoon. People are starting to come in from the villages. They just travel, get there, hear someone speaking, 10,000 people. So they're starting to show up. He gets hit with malaria, and he has no malaria medicine. And he is laying in his hut with shivers, just feeling like death warmed over. And Sammy Giordano, who was heading up the crusade, walks into his room and says, "What's the matter, Pastor?" He said, "I've got malaria. I can't preach." He says, "You have to preach. There's 10,000 people here to see you." He said, "I need to be healed." He said, "No problem." He prayed. He said, "Be healed." He said, 5 minutes, Dr. Brown said, 5 minutes later, I'm fine. I get up, preach. I never dealt with malaria the rest of that trip again. God does the miraculous. He says 2 years later, he's in South America, in a very developed part of that continent, and he's in a hotel room, and he gets struck with malaria. And he's there, and he's saying, "God, heal me, God, heal me, God, heal me," and no healing comes. One of the men that was traveling with them knocks on his hotel room door and says, "Are you okay, Pastor?" He says, "No, I've got malaria." He said, "Here, I've got malaria medicine." Is that any less of a miracle? You know, he needed the supernatural in West Africa. Here, the medicine sufficed. So sometimes we don't see miracles. We're not where we need to be. We're not where we need a miracle. Sometimes we don't see them because miracles are uncommon. They don't happen all the time. The second reason I believe we don't see as many miracles today is this. We tend to be skeptical. Listen, it only takes once to be fooled by a charlatan who claims to have done some supernatural thing, and then there's some expose done on 60 Minutes, and you find out the guy is a fraud, and the next time somebody comes in claiming miracles, you say, "Yeah, I don't think so." I believe some of us, if Jesus was here today doing the miracles he did 2,000 years ago, we would tend to be skeptical. Water to wine, that's a sleight of hand. Penn and Teller can do that. Feeding 5,000 with a few loaves and fish, that's a parlor trick. Come on. Anybody could pull that. It's just an illusion. It's not real. We tend to be skeptical because we've been fooled before. As a matter of fact, here's the thing. 2,000 years ago, when Jesus walked the earth and did his miracles, people were skeptical then too. They heard the reports. People said, "Oh, he did this. He fed the 5,000. He made the blind to see. He's raised the dead." And people said, "Yeah, I want to see it." So here's one of the things they said to Jesus. They asked him, "What sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do?" Yeah, we've heard all the reports. What are you going to do now that we're here? We want to see it. We want to believe, but we're not going to believe what we've heard. We want to believe what we see. We want to explore it. So we tend to be skeptical, and it's understandable. It is very understandable that we're skeptical because we have been fooled. There was a missionary in the Peruvian rainforest, and he is speaking to the villagers there and the chief, and they're having a conversation, and then the chief stops in the middle of the conversation, and he points to the sky and says, "Now what's that?" And up in the sky, there's just a small little object, and it's leaving a trail of white behind it. And the missionary begins to explain, that's a jet. It's this airplane. It goes across the sky. They say, "Well, explain this to us. We want to understand." And so he begins to explain what an airplane is and aerodynamics, and it was quite the conversation between a missionary and Peruvian villagers. But he shows them the size of a jet. And as it dawns on them that this vessel, this vehicle that he claims is flying through the air, can somehow carry and transport their entire village, their skepticism rises to high levels. "No way. We can't believe it. We won't believe. This can't be true." And they all begin to doubt and have these things. And then the village chief raises his hands and says, "We don't know. What I know is he's here. And he says he got here by flying on a jet. And he says jets are big. When I look in the sky, I see a small thing. But when I see a bird in the sky, it's small too." And then his wife says, "But why should we believe him?" And the chief says, "Why should we doubt? I would like one day to travel and see a jet. But until I do, I'll simply believe." Sometimes when we hear reports of the supernatural, our default is to say, "Let me prove it's not." I went to high school with a guy his life was off the rails. He was into drugs, alcohol, pornography. In his late 20s, he got miraculously saved, and God uses him as an evangelist and does ministry and just it's awesome. And he talks about sometimes how he prays for people and he sees a miracle. And even me, maybe it's because I'm too educated with my master's or doctor of divinity or whatever. I'm tired. Doctor of ministry. That I go, I don't know. I've heard that before. I've seen those, and I have to stop and go. Can't I just simply believe? Can't I believe that God still does the supernatural? See, it's easy to doubt that God is doing the supernatural if you're standing on the street corner and the bus isn't coming. And you're going, it's not real, I don't believe it. But if you step off the street corner and go to where the miracles are needed, your skepticism may turn to faith. So one of the reasons we don't see a lot of miracles, or as many as we think we should, is miracles are uncommon. We need to be where miracles need to happen. The second reason is we tend to be skeptical. The third is this. We think miracles should happen a certain way. We believe if God's going to move, whatever that way is to you, it may be something you experienced early in your walk with the Lord. It may be something you've seen on TV. It may be some article you read. But we think this is the way God's supposed to move. And if he doesn't move within this prescribed way, then it can't be a miracle. But this has been an issue through human history. So there was this man named Naaman. He was a leader in his country, and he was afflicted with leprosy. And he found out that there was a prophet, Elisha, in Israel who could bring healing. So he goes off to the nation of Israel and he inquires of the king, and the king sends him to Elisha. And this is what happens. Elisha sent a messenger to say to Naaman, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. But Naaman thought miracles should happen a certain way. And it says, Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand. Make some pixie dust appear from the sky over the spot of my leprosy and cure it. I believe one of the reasons we don't see miracles is we think God's supposed to move this way. This is the way the miracle is supposed to come. It's what it's supposed to look like. It's how God's supposed to operate. And if he doesn't, well, it's somehow not really a miracle. Somehow it's less than a miracle. So I remember for me, I was at a church and I was praying, fasting, seeking the face of God. God, bring unity to the leadership team of this church because we are divided and this church is going to get torn apart. God, do a miracle. Do a miracle in the hearts of the leaders of this church because they're hard and they're angry and they're bitter and they're resentful. God, do something awesome. And I prayed and prayed and prayed. And the way God was supposed to move was to heal the hearts of those men and bring unity to the leadership of the church. And we were supposed to move forward and accomplish great things for God. Instead, God said, no, I'm going to take you out of that church. And he took me out of that church. But what I didn't know was at the same time I was praying that prayer, there's this church here in Greenwood, Delaware. And there's division and there's discourse and there's things that are happening and they're praying, God, bring unity here. God, bring us a sense of oneness. Help us to overcome all this stuff that's threatening to fracture our church. And so God answered my prayer in a miraculous way. He led me some 700 odd miles from where I was to this church in Delaware. And 7 years later, we have unity, we have vision, we have mission, and we have not looked back. But if God had to move the way I thought he had to move, I would never be here. We would never see the miracle God had. See, if a miracle happens different than you want, it does not make it less a miracle. I think sometimes we don't see miracles is because we say this is what the miracle is supposed to look like. And so we're waiting and watching and going, I want that miracle, I want that miracle, I want that miracle. And God's over here waving a flag going, here's your miracle. No miracles. So let me give you a really personal level. So about a year and a half ago, maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I thought, we've got 3 children. And I'm blessed. I've got the 3 greatest children I could ever ask for. But I started thinking, God, maybe we should have had more. But yeah. I'll reserve judgment. But we had done some things to ensure that no more children would come. So I said, God, do a miracle. If you want us to have another child, do a miracle. And no child came. And then in December of this past year, a situation came to our knowledge about at that point, 12-year-old boy who needed a home. And now we're in the process of bringing that child into our home. But if I had said the miracle has to be this, we'd miss the miracle that God's bringing into our family. So we have to learn to say, I might not see the miracle the way I think it's supposed to come. God, like Naaman, just wave your hand over the leprosy and make it go away. Matter of fact, he said, you should have go ask me to wash in a great river. Do something courageous and challenging. But the Jordan, if you've ever been to Israel, the Jordan, we call it the Jordan River. It's the Jordan mud hole. It's not a river. It's a brook. It's a stream. So, we don't think in the way that that's a miracle. But we don't see miracles because sometimes we define it as it's got to look a certain way. So miracles aren't common, but they're happening, and expect a miracle. Miracles don't always happen the way we think they should, the way we think they should look, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. And we tend to be skeptical. At some point you have to step back and say, I'm going to believe. I'm going to believe for the supernatural. So I want to really quick give you 3 ways. Those are why we don't see miracles, I believe. How do we see a miracle? What do we need to do? How do we need to change and reorient the way we think, the way we approach God when it comes to needing a miracle so that we can see them happening in our lives? Here's the first thing. Stand in faith. Stand in faith. Please hear me. People will teach. The more faith you have, the more you'll see the miraculous. I don't believe that. I do believe if we don't have faith, we probably won't see the miraculous. But God isn't there keeping score going, oh man, your faith is at a 72. If you can just ratchet it up to a 75, you'll get the miracle. We used to have a dog. And I used to like to torment my dog. So I'd hold the treat where he would run and jump and just not quite be able to get to it. And he'd just miss it. And I'd say, come on, boy. And he'd jump and he'd just miss it. And I'd get it a little lower and then I'd lift it up. Okay, a God who demands just the right amount of faith is tormenting us. Just a little more faith and you'll get the miracle. Oh, you were so close. That's not a loving God. That's me, a dog owner. God says, yes, you need to have faith. But in having faith, you're also going to wrestle with unbelief. So here's this man in the Bible, and he has a son, and his son is afflicted with some type of seizures. The seizures would grab him, and he'd stiffen up, he'd foam at the mouth. It was horrible. It had been happening his whole life. And he brings his son to Jesus' disciples. Jesus is up in the mountain with Peter, James, and John, and the rest of the disciples are there, and he says, pray for my son, heal him. And they pray and pray and pray, and he's not healed. And then Jesus comes back down off the mountain. The man runs to Jesus and says, if you can do anything, please heal my son. Oh, if you can do it, please heal my son. And here's Jesus' response. Jesus said to him, if you can do anything, do you know who I am? I can do anything. All things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe. Help my unbelief. See, God's not going, just have a little more faith. Oh, you had doubt. A little more faith. Oh, unbelief. God says, I know in your belief you have doubt, you have unbelief. It's a mixture because we are human. See, really what that's saying is this. I know God can, but I wonder if God will. And that doesn't frustrate the heart of our Heavenly Father. It does not. God, I know you can. I just don't know if you will, but help me to believe that you will. Help me to get to the point where I believe that you will, because I know that you can. And God, I'm believing that you will. And we go back and forth. And God says, now, believe, have faith, stand in faith, pray in faith, believe in faith, and don't stop praying. I tell people all the time, I will pray for a miracle until I no longer need to pray. Pray. Pray for healing until you no longer need to pray for healing. Stand in faith until that prayer is answered. But don't stop. Faith pushes forward and pushes through. The next thing is this. If you want to see your miracle, use what's in your hand. So often we think God has to move outside of us. For it to be a true miracle, it has to be wholly otherworldly. That somehow God can't use the stuff of earth in order to do something supernatural. If he does, it diminishes the miracle. But the reality is God almost always works through us, through the stuff of earth. Right? Jesus feeds the 5,000 with what? Couldn't Jesus just have said food? But he says, give me loaves, give me fish. Here's these men, their friend is sick, he's a paralytic and he can't walk, and they want him healed. What do? They lower him down in front of Jesus. Jesus makes mud, puts it on someone's eyes so they can see. A woman crawls through the crowd just to touch the hem of Jesus' robe. God's constantly saying, use what's in your hand. As a matter of fact, Moses, the great deliverer of the people of Israel, God calls him in the wilderness, burning bush, shows up, begins speaking, a bush that's on fire but it's not consumed, and Moses is blown away by it. And God speaks to him and says, now, I want you to go back. You're in the wilderness. I want you to go back to Egypt, to my people, and lead them. Tell them I've sent you. Now, think. You're no different than Moses. Hey guys, I was just talking to a fire. And the fire told me to come and set you free. So Moses is like, listen, if I go back and tell them a fiery bush told me to set them free, they're not going to believe me. And here's what God says. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw the staff on the ground and it became a snake. God uses what's in our hand. And if you read the rest of the story of Moses, all the way through the Exodus, all the way through the wilderness, that staff is from that moment forward referred to as the staff of the Lord. Because God says, I want to use what's in your hand. And if you will allow me to work through it, it's no longer just a natural staff. It's a supernatural vessel that I can use. So we have to realize that most miracles require human cooperation. Use what's in your hand. It doesn't make it somehow less miraculous. So God could have just made a snake appear out of the dust. That's how he created the livestock to begin with. But he says, no, I want to use what's in your hand. So when you go to the Pharaoh, use that staff. Use that staff and hold it over the Red Sea. Use that staff in miraculous ways. So somehow we have to get to that point and realize that God supernaturally uses the natural. If you want to see miracles, stand in faith and use what's in your hand. I think so often we're just afraid. Well, I'm forcing God. Really? You think you can force God into a miracle? You know, you're stronger than me. We can't force God to do anything, but we can cooperate, and God works through human cooperation. So the last thing, so if you want to see miracles, stand in faith, use what's in your hand, and here's the last thing. Do not limit what God wants to do. So often, kind of like I said, we expect a miracle to look a certain way. We also expect God to do a certain thing. And if he doesn't do the thing that we think he's going to do, then he didn't do a miracle. And so we miss out. So let me give you an example from the Bible. Lazarus is a friend of Jesus. He's got two sisters, Mary and Martha, and Lazarus is sick. And they report to Jesus, who's not in that town. He's a few days away. And they report, Lazarus, the one you love, your good friend is sick. Come heal him. We want a miracle. The miracle should be Lazarus' healing. But the Bible tells us in John chapter 11 that Jesus delays. He doesn't go right away. And he tells them it's better that I don't go right away because you can see something even more miraculous. So he waits, and then Lazarus dies, and he kind of speaks metaphorically to his followers, and he says, Lazarus has fallen asleep, let's go. And they're like, if he's sleeping, somebody will wake him up. Why do we have to go? And so Jesus says, how long must I be with you? And this is what he says. So Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. He's not just sleeping, he's dead. And I think he looks at his followers and says, sometimes I think you are. But for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. Parenthetical, I wasn't there to heal him, to do the miracle they wanted, so that you may believe. Now let's go to him. So they start walking, and it's another 2-day journey. So now at this point, Lazarus has been dead 4 days, buried in a tomb with a stone in front. And Jesus shows up at the edge of town, and Mary and Martha hear about it, and Martha runs out to meet Jesus. And then later on, Mary does the same. And Martha runs out, and this is what she says to him. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. You would have healed him. That was the miracle we were waiting for. But even now, I know whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Is she asking for a resurrection? It sounds like it. But as we read on, we realize she's not asking for a resurrection. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. God, I know he'll come back, but not now. He's been dead 4 days. Mary shows up later, says, Lord, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And so Jesus does a supernatural miracle. He tells him, move the stone. They're like, he's been dead 4 days. It's going to stink. He says, don't worry about it. Rolls the stone away, says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus is resurrected. So there's two things we learn in this when we talk about don't limit how God can move. Don't limit what he can do. The first is this: God is moving even when you don't see it. See, Mary and Martha praying for Lazarus' healing. And they're waiting. Jesus show up, Jesus show up, Jesus show up. And Jesus starts moving. But they don't see it. They don't see it because he's not there. God's moving. We don't see it because he's not moving exactly where we are when we need it. And so we doubt that God's moving. But Jesus is walking. He's making his way. He's having conversations. He's setting up exactly what he wants to do. So you may not see God moving. It doesn't mean he isn't setting up the pieces in order to accomplish a great miracle. The second thing is this: the miracle you get may not be the miracle you expect. They expected Lazarus to be healed. And when he wasn't healed, they said, well, we'll see him again on the last day. They limited what God could do to a physical healing. And Jesus said, how about a resurrection? No. We need a physical healing, and you weren't here. If you had been here, we would have got the physical healing. God, we don't doubt you, but you weren't here, so that's the miracle we expected. There is no more miracles. And Jesus says, there is another miracle. The miracle you get may not be the miracle you expect, so you have to stop limiting what God wants to do. You've prayed and you've prayed and you've prayed for that new job, for that promotion, for that marriage, for that child, and it hasn't come, and you say, well, I guess I'm not going to get it. And God says, you may not get that. And you can keep praying for that, stand in faith, don't stop praying for that, but don't be so focused on that you miss another miracle over here, because you may miss it. We don't see miracles because we're so focused on what we think we ought to get that we miss what God wants to give us. So there was a missionary, young man, loved the Lord, and he was overseas doing a great work. The outreach he had to this unreached people group was amazing. People were getting saved. God was moving in the supernatural. And in the midst of all that, he begins to have this pain in his muscles. He doesn't know what it is. It gets worse and worse. Turns out he's diagnosed with a rare neurological disease that eventually will leave him crippled and in a wheelchair. So the missions board that he reported to said, you have to come back. You can't stay. He's devastated. God, why? Why? With everything that's happening, why this? Why here? Why now? And as he goes back to the States, in a small little apartment outside of Atlanta, in the suburbs of Atlanta, he cries out to God for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. God, heal me. God, restore my body. God, let me go back on the mission field. God, let me be used by you to reach the lost, to see people come to faith, to start churches, to transform lives. God, let me go back. Let me go back. Let me go back. And he's so focused on that for 5 years he prays, and 5 years he sees nothing. And the disease progresses, and now he's in a wheelchair. And he stops praying for supernatural healing. And he begins to just write letters and send emails to missionaries that he knows all around the world. Starts with encouragement and praying for them. And over time, he begins to create an international network of missionaries that he prays for and he encourages and sends resources to. And for 30 years, he had a worldwide ministry that touched more people than he ever would have if he had simply gone back. All from a small one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs of Atlanta. We have to look and we have to see with eyes beyond limiting. God can only do this. So I'm going to ask if the worship team would come forward. Here's what I'd like to do this morning. We're going to sing a song. It's called Waymaker. You've probably heard it. And as we sing this song, you begin to think in your own heart, what's the miracle I need? What is that miracle that I'm believing for? Am I standing in faith? Or have I limited what God can do? Have I started to doubt? Am I willing to use what's in my hand, just like that missionary? He had contacts. He had names. He had email addresses. He used what he had. Laptop desk in the suburbs of Atlanta, and he began to send emails. Use what's in your hand and don't limit what God wants to do. God, you can't use me. I'm in a wheelchair. Why not? Why not? God can use you. God can do the miraculous. So I'm going to ask if you'd stand to your feet. As the worship team begins to play, you just think about what it is that you need. What miracle do you need this morning?